Good morning. May have to turn that up just a hair. Is that about right? Okay. Haskell called me yesterday morning and said he wasn't going to make it. He has the pink eye. He didn't want to come up here and expose you to it. Robert is in Socorro preaching there this morning, so it fell my lot. I think it's been about 2 years since I've spoken to you. Today we're going to take a look at Samson. I'm not as interested in Samson as I am God's response to Samson. God dealing with Samson. God dealing with Israel. And I want you to be thinking about God this morning. Why are you going back over there? We learned those stories when I was a kid. Yeah, but I bet you weren't trying to put yourself in God's shoes back then. What is a judge anyway? Well, it was the form of government that God used for a number of years. An inexpensive way to rule a nation. I usually tell people this man lived over here in a little white house and ran the country. And that's kind of the way it was. They had no standing army like King Saul. King Saul had 3,000 men standing army. And guess who had to pay the price for all that food? And the father being out of the family, no ladies in the army yet. Very costly once they got a king. But God set it up to rule them with simplicity. Samuel was I believe, number 12. He was more like Gideon. You see, they weren't all preachers. Sometimes they were warriors. Sometimes that's what God wanted. Jephthah, I believe he was number 7. He was a warrior. He's the one who said, God, you give me victory. And I'll give you whatever, the first thing that comes from my house. I'll sacrifice it to you. God gave him victory. And up walks his little daughter. Kind of a foolish thing that he hadn't thought through. But he was a judge of Israel. Let's go back and look at chapter 13. The entire chapter is devoted to an angel of the Lord approaching Manoah, Samson's father. His mother's name is never given. In their culture, it was a man's world. I never did count them, but maybe 20 prominent ladies that you can find. Some very prominent ones. An angel came and told Manoah's wife, you're going to have a child. And he's going to be a Nazirite. And while you're pregnant, you're not to take of any strong drink, anything that comes from the vine. And he's not to have a razor on his head all of his life. He's going to be something special. And Samson ruled Israel for 20 years. We come on to Samson. All of a sudden, he takes a little stroll down to the Philistine country. And on the way down, a lion comes out and attacks him. God gave him strength, and he just took and shredded this lion. Threw it over there by the side. While he was the next little town, he found a pretty girl, and he wanted to marry her. Now look at the complications here. Against the law. And he was instructed he was not to marry outside. I don't know if you realized it, but this is one of the things that caused the neighbors to not be so fond of the Israelites. You can't intermarry, because your heart will be turned to idolatry. Look at old Solomon. He married the daughter of a whole bunch of kings, about 700 of them. They turned his heart. At the very end of his life, he made gods like Dagon and several others. David's son. He came home and demanded of his parents, "Go get me that woman." Don't know how old he was, but he was kind of rude to his parents. He didn't invite, he more or less demanded. Now here's the part that you have to be careful. God was with him as he approached the Philistines. Well, what's it all about anyway? For 40 years, God allowed the Philistines to rule his people. Why? Wickedness. What was wickedness? Probably 90% of the time it was idolatry. As you read through the Old Testament, you read about fornication and adultery. Most of the time we're talking about idolatry. Well, how do you know the difference? Context. You just have to read carefully, and it comes out in context. Now, what about us today? Now, let's dig into our hearts. How close do we come to idolatry? How close do we come to things that are awfully, awfully important to us? And are they ever put ahead of God? Now, that's one of the things we want to look at each time that old Samson gets involved. Time-wise, we're talking, say, somewhere around 1060 BC. Maybe 60 years before King David. As he comes back from one of the trips, we see a little bit of the culture. He calls her his wife, or she's referred to as his wife, but it was kind of like Joseph and Mary. It was a betrothal. And the first time, they kind of had a quarrel. And the father said, "Well, you left and you didn't seem to love her. I gave her to somebody else." Well, old Samson, he only responds to anything when he's angry. God's still with him. God's still giving him strength. He made a riddle. Better finish that part about the lion. As he was on his way back home, he looked over there at that old lion carcass. Ah, the bees have been here. There's some honey. So he dipped in and took some of that honey. Then he took some home to his parents. But he didn't tell them where it came from. Well, why not? He's a Nazarite. He couldn't touch a dead object. He couldn't worship. Made him unclean. You see, Samson had this one little problem. He basically let his anger control him. Now he did good. God stuck with him. God gave him strength each time he went into one of these episodes. He made a riddle about the honey and the lion's carcass. He says, well, I'll give you 30 suits of clothes if you guess my riddle. And if you don't, you give me 30 suits of clothes. Well, they weaseled it out of his girlfriend, his fiancée. And he says, why, if you hadn't plowed with my heifer, that's good old language 3,000 years ago. Wouldn't go over too well today. I just always thought that was kind of interesting. Plowed with my heifer. Later, over this episode, finally they burned his wife and her father. Old Samson. He goes out there and catches 300 foxes. God's still with him. He gives them strength each time he does this. He ties their tails together 2 at a time and turned them loose through their grain fields. Wow. Because of what these people did to him, they all suffered. Do we suffer today because somebody else messed up? You ever have to stay in at class because somebody else messed up? Well, he made them suffer. One day he picked up the jawbone of an ass or donkey, whatever, and killed 1,000 people. God was with him, gave him strength. Well, now, what's the purpose of all this behavior? He's a Nazirite. God spent a whole chapter teaching how he should behave, how he should go into this thing. What was a Nazirite all about? Would you say moral and spiritual purity? If he was completely restricted from drinking strong drink, it seems to me. Well, did Solomon get a glimpse of his responsibility? It's not written in the text. God may have privately told him, but we don't have a copy of it. God kept on, stayed with him. And then one day, he goes off, I believe it was to Gaza, the main town for the Philistines. Philistia is over on the west bank of Israel. Kind of a small country, but they always had a bigger army. One place says they had more warriors than they could count. And they whipped the Israelites many times. What was this whole thing about? God was now, after 40 years of punishing them, he is now letting them, he's about to release them. Samson is a one-man army. First he kills 30, and then he kills 1,000 at another time, an unnumbered amount. You remember the story of Delilah. I'm not so much interested in just the details as I want you to see God in this. God can use anybody in his service. He used a number of people that weren't faithful to him. He used them. And he accomplishes his purpose. Somewhere along this time, God withdrew his spirit from Samuel. And I was reading this at my pleasure reading here a few weeks ago. And I've been scratching my head. Okay, why did God withdraw his spirit? He has gone with him. He went with him into Philistia, and he gave him power. He gave him power like no other man has ever had. Now he is withdrawing his spirit. Well, let's look at that in history. When he withdrew his spirit from King Saul for disobedience, what happened to King Saul? Scared him to death to think about battle the next day. You remember he called up, got a witch that he had declared death, if there are any witches at all still alive. Then he sends out and finds one. She invites him to call up Samuel. They didn't have that kind of power. God was behind the whole thing. The witch screams. She was the most surprised one of all. Samuel did come up because God wanted him to. He told him he was going to die in battle the next day, and his sons. He was terrified. He was going into a major battle, and he didn't have God with him. When David talked about this, you see, David didn't see it literally because he was on the run. But that was his best friend, Jonathan, that was going down with Saul. And in Psalm 51, David said something like this: "Take not thy Holy Spirit from me." He was afraid God might do something like that. And David did his share of things that we might not want to get involved with right now. I want to go back to this removal of the Spirit. What would you do if God suddenly removed his Spirit from you? Would you want to go to work in the morning? Would you have the courage to keep on keeping your family together? Would you feel like worship? All this happened to Samson. Let's wrap up what we had with Delilah. She finally spilled the beans, or she told where his strength was. They plucked out his eyes. It's a little bit hard to finish that story. Some see in the story repentance on behalf of Samson. Maybe that's the case. He prayed to God, "God, remember me." Doesn't get much better than that. God, remember me. I want you to give me this one last request. I want it to be for revenge for my eyes. You say, that doesn't sound like the God I know. God said yes. I've been wrangling with that for days. You see, God's vision and his vision were different. God put him there to reverse this thing. Two nations. It was going to take more than diplomacy. He put old Samson out there, as I said earlier, as a one-man army. Did a pretty good job of that. His attitude was horrible. He only acted out of anger, and now revenge. Why does God do this? I don't know. He's God. He didn't place me here to question his activities. God knew that in that last round, all the leaders of Philistia were there. Now, you getting close to the answer? It starts off the book by saying he wants to start freeing Israel. Got all of them in one building, Temple of Dagon. And now they're having old Samson up here to entertain them. God, let me die with the Philistines. And he did. You remember he pulled that whole temple down. 3,000 people packed into that place. And all the leaders of the Philistines. Now, did God accomplish his purpose? Yeah, he did. And who am I to question the way he went about it? Has God touched your life lately? Do we always know when he touches our life? Or do we look backwards and say, wow, looks like God's testing me again? Those are 4 little short chapters. I'd like to invite you to read them before you go to bed tonight. Fill in a few of the gaps. I'd like for you to struggle with that. God granting a prayer like that of vengeance. You see, I don't think they were on the same track. God's looking at the nation. Samson is looking at revenge. Was it a partial victory? We don't have the rest of the story. But it seems to me that he wiped out all the leaders. Politically, could they contain them anymore? Very doubtful. God was releasing Israel from bondage. Are we in a political, spiritual bondage today? If we are, Jesus is always ready for us. I like the language of Jesus in Luke 10:20. Don't marvel that you're seeing miracles out here. Just make sure your name is written in the book of life. And that's what I would encourage each of us. Just make sure that our name is written in the book of life. And John adds one to that. If we're faithful until the end, he will give us that crown of life. If you're subject to God's invitation, if you'd like the prayers of the church, or if you'd like to be baptized, while we haven't really gone into great detail with that, this is certainly a beautiful time. Won't you come as we stand and sing?